Okay, we'll go ahead and start. My name is Britt Smith. I'm a postdoctoral research associate in the Dr. Boughton's lab here at University of Florida. And I am also associated with Archbold Biological Station, working with Dr. Betsy Boughton at Archbold. So today I'm going to talk to you a little bit about some of the research we've been doing in this network called LTAR, which I'll get to the description of that here in a minute. But looking at the effects of prescribed fire in rangelands and grazing lands down here in South Central Florida, and their effect and its effect on cattle and cattle's behavior and use of the pastures. And so this project is part of what's called LTAR, which is long-term agroecosystem research, and it's a network of research sites throughout the U.S. There's a total of 18 sites, and each of these sites is conducting independent but coordinated research. And so these agroecosystem experiments that are being conducted range from grazing lands to croplands, and within that there's rangelands, pasture lands, and then some other crop agriculture. And the goal of this project is to look at ways that we can intensify agriculture across the landscape while still maintaining ecosystem services like biodiversity, maintaining water quality, soil health, and finding better ways to manage the land and still produce agricultural products. So we are located here in Florida, South Central Florida. We have subtropical humid grasslands, and Florida is important for cattle because we have really high productivity rangelands. Around the state, we have around 5 million hectares of grazing lands, which is about 1/3 of the total area of the state of Florida. These are really high productive rangelands producing around 5 to 10 megagrams per hectare, or around 4,000 to 9,000 pounds per acre. On these lands, prescribed fire is a common land management tool used to help maintain these rangelands. And we are particularly interested in cattle grazing distribution and utilization of these rangelands in response to fire, because fire is a very historic disturbance in these systems. And so with the long-term agroecosystem research, we're interested in looking at common management techniques, which are typically called business as usual. These are techniques that have been used for the modern period. And so for our study, we're looking at a full burn in the first year of the study, and then no burn the next 2 years. So in 2017, we conducted a full burn of some of our pastures, half of our pastures, and then the following 2 years we did not burn, as you can see in those images on top there. And then we're interested in a better approach to managing these rangelands, what we call aspirational. And for this, our treatment is a patch burn grazing system, where we burn 1/3 of the pasture each year for each year of the study. A different patch each year of the study. And so our hypotheses about how cattle use these burned patches are dependent on scale. So we're interested in the within pasture response mostly, or that's what we're going to be looking at. So our first hypothesis is that cattle use will be greater in recently burned patches, and we believe this. There's a lot of evidence to suggest that this is common and will occur. There's many studies throughout the Great Plains and other studies throughout the world looking at grazing animal behavior and their attraction to recently burned pastures. And we expect that we'll see a similar trend compared to what these other studies have seen. We also hypothesize that we'll see greater evenness of cattle distribution throughout our pasture, greater evenness in the recently burned patch within our pasture, because fire consumes that dead vegetation, makes that recently burned patch more palatable, so they're attracted to that, and also in turn set some of those plants back so that plants that may have been unpalatable when they were in a larger growth form are now more palatable and tasty as a small regrowing plant. And so our study was conducted at the Buck Island Ranch, which is owned and operated by Archbold Biological Station. This ranch is around 4,000 hectares in size. Precipitation at this site is around 1,300 millimeters per year, or around 51 inches per year. This is a cow-calf operation producing beef calves, and the ranch contains a total of around 3,000 head of cattle. The ranch consists of both improved and semi-native pasture. In green, you can see on the map there in green is the demarcation of improved pasture, which is dominated by Bahia grass, which is an imported forage. And then in the orange color are our semi-native pastures, which include Bahia grass, but also have some native plant species like broomsedge bluestem, panic grass, and carpet grass. And you can see in here we have 16 study pastures that are divided between our patch burn grazing pastures, which are in red, and our full burn treatments, which are in blue. And in this study, the 4 pastures that occur there on the west side in the semi-native were actually excluded because these are really low productivity sites, and we had some management issues of moving cattle back and forth that didn't occur as we had hoped. And so our study design, we conducted prescribed fire in January of 2017, and then cattle were introduced into the pastures in February. The cattle were maintained in the pastures from February to December of 2017, and they were alternated between the patch burn treatments and full burn treatments. The pastures were around 16 hectares in size, with a total number of 16 treatment pastures in total. Stocking rates for these pastures were 32 cows in our improved pastures, and then the semi-native pastures was stocked with 15 cows. Cattle in our improved pastures were grazed throughout the year. Our semi-native pastures were grazed only during the dormant season, which ends about May, June, somewhere in there, and then the summer wet season, they're not grazed. To get at the cattle's behavior, we used 4 GPS units placed on collars, and so these GPS units, this is an example there on the lower left of one of these GPS units. It's about the size of a quarter. And this is similar to like a GPS unit that you would have on your phone or what's in a Garmin. The battery life of these units, you can see the unit as it's set up with the battery there in the middle. The battery life is around 6 months. We can normally get 8 months, but 6 months works well for us to estimate. The GPS units are set to record a GPS location once every 5 minutes. And we can store, with that battery length, we can store around 70,000 points per animal. And we have a total of 32 cows with collars out there in pastures at any given time. And then you can see the collar with the GPS unit attached there onto the cattle there on the right. And GPS units are not a perfect way to get a location. There is error associated with GPS units. And so our unit, this is a frequency distribution looking at location error. The graph in the middle is the unit that we're using. The graph above is another unit that's commonly used to track cattle called I Got You. And comparing those two, we can see that the accuracy of these 2 units is similar. However, the precision of the I Got You is a little bit worse as we see the histogram stretch out and we get some really large location errors that are spread out from where our true location is. And on the bottom are low-tech units. These are really common in wildlife studies. They're kind of the gold standard. And our units show a little bit higher accuracy, and the precision is very similar to what we see with low-techs. And a summary of the data that we receive from these GPS units. Over the year, with all our cattle, we get a total of 3.1 million GPS points. And these points are then truncated to our pasture boundaries. That way we know if it occurs outside the boundary, it's error. And that's known error because all our cattle are within the boundary. And with those GPS point locations, we can get at the cattle's behavior based on velocity. So the distance between points, if they're really close together, we demarcate that by 2 meters per minute. And we consider that resting behavior. If the cattle is moving between 2 and 20 meters per minute, so a wider distance between 2 points, then that's grazing. And if they're moving greater than 20 meters per minute, then we consider that to be traveling throughout the pasture. And on the right there is a graph of the distribution of resting, grazing, and traveling behaviors. And these are pretty comparable to other studies that have looked at GPS units and cattle behavior that have used other methods, such as accelerometers to get at their behavior and visual observation. And this is what we see using these breakpoints is pretty similar to other studies. And so for our study, we're particularly interested in those grazing points and where those grazing points occur in the pasture. So for the rest of the presentation, I will be talking specifically about those grazing points and not the resting points or traveling points. And this image on the bottom here is an example of 1 week's worth of points in one of the patch burn pastures. And different colors in this image represent different cattle with GPS colors. So there should be 4. But that just kind of shows you just how many points we get and are dealing with over a single week's period. And so the first analysis we're interested in is looking at grazing intensity across the pasture in relation to the burned patches. And to do this, we compared proportion of use between the patches and created a generalized linear model looking at the proportion of use modeled by patch and an interaction of date with pasture as a random variable. And so this graph is looking at the daily proportion of use for 5 different grazing periods. So each period of points you see on here is what we call a grazing period when the cattle are actually in the pasture, and there's 5 of them. And so our burns were conducted in January of 2017, and this is 1 year, 2017. And so our burns were conducted late January 2017, and cattle were then introduced early February. You can see on the leftmost grazing period that cattle, oh, sorry, I forgot to describe that line that's on there, is 33%. And this is where we would expect use to be even between the patches. So if those points fall along that line, they would be using each patch equally. We have burned patch in red, and then we have the 2 unburned patches are averaged in this to make it easier to see on the graph. And so we see when cattle are introduced into the pasture, they stay in the unburned areas because that burned area has been recently burned. The forage hasn't come back. There's no regrowth in there until we get some time away from that fire with ample soil moisture and precipitation. That grass will start to regrow. And as we can see on here, once that regrowth occurs, cattle disproportionately start moving into that burn patch and start grazing that burn patch way more than they do the unburned patches. We see them hanging out in that burned patch significantly more as time goes on, though that response decays over time. and then they start moving between the pastures there at the end of that first grazing period. And this is because there's a lot of cattle in that pasture and they're consuming that forage pretty hard. And so then they start moving. We see when they're in the second grazing period, they're reintroduced into the pasture, they immediately go to that recently burned patch and start grazing it. And we see this trend throughout the entire year where cattle are grazing that burned patch throughout the entire year. So it's a year-long effect of that burn patch on the cattle behavior. Breaking that down into the improved pastures versus the semi-native pastures. So we have a total of 4 improved pastures and then 2 semi-native pastures in this study. And we see the similar trend in both the improved and semi-native pastures. The effect is maybe a little weaker, especially in that second grazing period in the improved pastures compared to the other grazing periods. And in semi-native, the 2 grazing periods that cattle were in there for, we see a significant response. And modeling, we modeled each grazing period separately, and we found significant results of date and treatment interaction. And looking at our full burn, so we don't have patches in the full burn. However, we kind of divided our pasture up into what we call sectors. So these are kind of analogous to pastures, but there are no analogous to patches in the patch burn pasture, but there are no patches. It's just to give us something to compare to. And so here again, we see different grazing periods throughout the year. That first one is what we would expect if the cattle are using each portion of the pasture equally, where we see it pretty close to that 33% of use for each patch. And we see a fairly equal use of the entire pasture throughout the entire year. That third grazing period gets a little wonky, and that's probably just a few pastures pulling that data apart. Yeah, so to summarize all that, in the patch burn pastures, we see this strong attraction to the recently burned patch, whereas in a full burn pasture, we see even use throughout the entire pasture. And so the second portion of this that we're also interested in is looking at evenness inside the pasture, particularly in relation to these burned and unburned patches. So we did 2 studies, or two tests, and this is still, this analysis is still in progress. So I did 2 because these are 2 common techniques that are used to examine evenness within the pasture, or evenness among points. The first one I did was a quadrat analysis. And this, we used 30 by 30 cells placed throughout in a grid placed on the pasture, and looked at the points that fell within the cells. And then we used a technique called Ripley's K, which also looks at clumped versus evenness of spread of our points or grazing locations, and did a permutation test to examine if we found significant difference or not. And so I'm going to start off with a hypothetical example to kind of make this easier as we go through it. So this is a patch burn treatment pasture. That 2017 indicates when the burn was done. So that patch on the far left was burned in 2017. The patch on the far right burned 2018. And the patch that's in the middle was burned this year, 2019. And it shows a variation of different points located or spatially different. So in the 2017, we see a hypothetical of what an even grazing distribution would look like. In that 2019 patch, we see what 2 clumped grazing distributions would look like. And then 2018, we see what a single clumped grazing distribution would look like in that patch. And a histogram of that In 2017, we see a lot of cells that have just a count of 1. And in 2018, that far right patch, we see this long spread of a few points, a few singular points, and a few cells that have a lot of points. And in that 2019, we see, again, a large spread of some more cells having few points and some cells having a lot of points. And so that kind of gives you an idea. And the main thing that we are interested in is the spread of that points. Let's see if I can get this to work. Yeah. Okay, so what we're really interested in here is the spread. So we have a very short spread. We have a lot of cells that have just a few points in it. And so the spread along here is, which I'll refer to as variation, is very small. Compared to 2018, which has a large spread, we have some cells that just have a few points and some cells that have a lot of points. So we have a large spread here. And then in the 2019 patch, we also have a large spread. So looking at our example, this is that same pasture. This is 1 week's worth of points. And we can kind of see on this that we see areas where we have clusters of cells or clusters of points. In the 2019 patch, in the 2018, we see some other areas that are kind of patchy. In the 2019, we see this one patch here, but visually we can kind of see that this appears a little more even than the 2019 or the 2018 patch. This recently burned patch looks just slightly more even, but we need to conduct analyses to see whether that's true. And this is just one of our pastures. There are 5 others. And this is just 1 week's worth of points over time. So looking at a histogram of that 1 week, this is all the pastures together. We see we have more cells that have few points compared to the other, the 2 unburned patches, which have cells that have more points in them. So we have these cells containing a few points are much lower in count than cells containing higher points. Yeah, and so what we're interested again here is that variation across this x-axis. And we're also interested in the mean, and the method I'll use to describe this variation looks at this variation over the mean. So the mean of this 2017 patch is going to be farther to the left, and these 2018 and 2019, the mean is going to be farther to the right. Oh, and these I also did some statistical analysis on this using a Kruskal-Wallis test, which is a non-parametric test that's analogous to an ANOVA. However, since it's non-parametric, we can use it on non-normal data, which is definitely not normal. A normal distribution would look like a bell shape. And this is a Poisson distribution in specific. And so we did a Kruskal-Wallis test to see if there was a difference between these 2017, 2018, and 2019 patches. And with that test, we found no significant difference. I also did a generalized linear model using a Poisson distribution, and that too did not come out significant. So we didn't see a difference in evenness between these patches with those tests. And so looking at that variation and mean, I used what's called standard deviation, which is a measure of variation divided by the mean. And this gives an index called coefficient of variation. And when the coefficient of variation is low, we would expect a more even grazing distribution compared to a high coefficient of variation, which would indicate more clustered or clumped grazing. And so in this, I haven't analyzed it statistically yet, but we do see that in general, the burned patch appears more even than the other two unburned patches. There are some spots where we see really no difference, but again, I haven't looked at this statistically to see how it comes out. But it's some weak evidence. And so the second analysis I did was used what's called Ripley's K function, and this is kind of to give you an idea of that. This it's a function over distance. So this is an example where we measure the distance between points within this ringed distance, and then take that for each distance out to get this long function, which we can see here in the bottom right corner. If the points were totally random in the pasture, we would see this blue line, which is called complete spatial random. If the pattern were clustered, we would see the observed points move up along this function. And if the grazing distribution were spaced evenly throughout that pasture, we would see this, it would move below that complete spatial random line to this more dispersed pattern. And to give you an idea, again, this is our point in just a single pasture over a single week. And so this is 1 week's worth of points. Each pasture is represented on its own in this. And we see burned in black, red is one of the unburned patches, and then green is the other unburned patch. And what we see here is they all kind of trend really similarly. This one burned patch actually appears, this is 1 week's worth of points again. I do have this for each week also. But this one patch in this pasture appears to be more clustered compared to the other patches in the other pastures. And this is where I did the randomization test to examine if there was a difference in Ripley's K between these patches, and I did not see a significant difference in Ripley's K. But all the patches show some trending of being more clustered than just randomly distributed within that patch. And so I took the test statistic of that analysis and looked at the full burn versus the patch burn. And full burn is in red and patch burn is in black. And what we see is that this line up here at the top is if the point crosses that line, then it would be statistically significant. None of them were statistically significant. However, we did see it get fairly close, and the patch burn was fairly close, more close than the full burn. And this, had we had more replicates, it's possible that we would have seen some of these points go above that significance mark, and that would suggest that one of our patches is significantly different than the other two patches in terms of clustering or evenness. And so in total, this graph suggests that there may be a treatment effect of that burned patch and how cattle are using it compared to a full burn pasture. And so in conclusion, we did see cattle use the burned area more across the year compared to the unburned patches. And in terms of evenness, we did not significantly see a difference between the patch burned patches. And the implication of this is that cattle are attracted to recently burned areas throughout the entire year here in Florida, which we had originally thought that maybe they would just be attracted to the patches over a short period of time. You would get the spring rains and it would kind of wash out that effect, but we do see them going back to that recently burned patch over the entire year, which is consistent with a lot of other studies throughout the world, Australia, Africa, and the Great Plains in particular. And we also saw that there may possibly be an influence of fire may influence grazing evenness in these pastures. However, there was just very weak evidence for that. Maybe with some more treatments, we could pull that out, but currently we haven't been able to observe that. And so in humid subtropical grasslands, patch burning can increase cattle distribution heterogeneity throughout the pasture. And with that, I can take any questions. And if you have any questions online for those folks joining the webinar, I will pull them up. Yep.
In the wintertime, those cows probably receive supplement.
Mm-hmm.
How do you account for supplement, water, and minerals attracting them versus your treatments?
Sure. So we actually didn't see them. They certainly are attracted to water, but we get so many points, and they do that. A lot of those points ended up being classified as resting because they're not moving very much. So when we just look at those grazing points, it takes out a lot of the points that are around protein and water sites. So we actually didn't account for it. We just left those points in there as is. There have been some other methods. Some people have put a buffer around supplements and water and just remove those points. We just left them in